The US dollar takes a nosedive. Ripples are felt across the world. Will the euro be the solution? Next on Global Pulse. A comparison of how broadcasters worldwide are covering this story.
The weakening dollar has been the subject of much wailing and gnashing of teeth in recent months.
A look at the euro's continued dramatic climb against the US dollar.
The Chinese yuan broke the 7.45 mark against the US dollar on Wednesday.
Statements like these are being made in the media across the globe as the value of the US dollar decreases. Al Jazeera English explains how this affects the US economy and economies worldwide.
The Eurozone's currency has never been this strong. In the past 3 months, the euro has continued to climb, nudging $1.50 at the weekend.
It would be good if the dollar could regain its strength.
The
mirror bra has been a thriving part of the French market for 2 centuries. 40 salaried workers, 100% local production, and a space in the luxury hotel market. The company was thriving, but these products are manufactured in euros. Its competitors sell in dollars. The green bills are worth much less than the European currency. The consequence is that the French mirrors are markedly more expensive. This small company has already lost business.
The dollar's decline affects politics and oil, as Mexico's Once Noticias reports.
Hugo Chavez and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad met in Tehran to sign new cooperation agreements. Both agree and are insisting on enforcing the proposal to abandon the use of the dollar presented at the OPEC meeting.
Soon we won't talk about dollars. Look, the dollar is shrinking, and is shrinking the dollar empire and the U.S. empire with it.
But the dollar's decline may not be so bad for European tourists and U.S. retailers, as NBC News reports.
Airlines like Virgin actually advertise 3-day shopping blitzes in cities like New York and Boston. Bring an empty suitcase, they say, and you'll fill it.
We are like crazy shopping.
And shopping is the mission, not sightseeing. Some come all the way here to then take an hour bus ride to a suburban outlet mall for bargains.
I'm probably saving about £200, so about $400 compared to the price in the UK.
And a pound saved here is a dollar earned for the U.S. economy.
This is Erin Coker for Global Pulse.
They all now use one currency. You see, the transformation of Europe into a single national body with its own bank, legislative body, and military force took many, many years to accomplish, about 42 to be exact. It began with the Treaty of Paris in 1951, and that created the European Coal and Steel Community. And then when the 1957 Treaty of Rome was signed, it morphed into the European Economic Community. In 1993, by order of the Maastricht Treaty, it was renamed the European Community and then absorbed by the newly formed European Union. So how do you dissolve a nation's sovereignty peacefully and with the people's consent?
Now, I'm the first to acknowledge that there's a good deal left unfinished on the conservative agenda. Our cleanup crew will need more than 2 years to deal with the mess left by others for over half a century.
Now, it all began with Ronald Reagan, Republican, in 1979. He was campaigning, and while he was campaigning, he proposed the North American Agreement to produce, quote, a North American continent in which the goods and people of the 3 countries will cross boundaries more freely. He fulfilled that campaign promise in 1981 when he presented the idea of a North American common market. Then 4 years later, in 1985, he notified Congress of his desire to begin negotiations with Canada on a free trade agreement to promote trade. He gives then Congress 90 days to approve it. 2 years later, in October of 1987, the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement is finalized. U.S. Trade Representative Clayton Uter said of the agreement, quote, we've signed a stunning new trade pact with Canada. The Canadians don't understand what they've signed. In 20 years, they will be sucked into the U.S. economy. With Reagan sealing up Canada in 1990, the new president, George H.W. Bush, would begin work on Mexico.
It is a big idea, a new world order,
where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
And just 2 years later, in December of 1992, Bush, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney officially signed the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as NAFTA.
Calling it a defining moment, President Clinton, with great fanfare, signed legislation putting the North American Free Trade Agreement into law.
Then in 1993, President Bill Clinton, he signs on to NAFTA and then executes the agreement, creating the North American Development Bank and the Border Environment Cooperation Commission. Another year later, Miami, the Summit of the Americas, 1994. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico invite Chile and 33 more nations to join, expanding the pact to be called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, or the FTAA. Barriers to trade and investment are eliminated. Flash forward 6 years, the year 2000. While Americans are celebrating their independence, this July 4th would mark a new date in world history. The date Mexican President Vicente Fox proposes his 20 to 30-year timeline for the creation of a common North American market. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz is working for the Bush-Cheney presidential campaign as their domestic policy advisor.
It's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming.
So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Let's take a look at the events of the past decade and see if you see a pattern. In Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, which they intended to use to replace the dollar in that region. US and NATO forces helped destabilize and topple the Libyan government in 2011, and after taking control of the region, US armed rebels executed Gaddafi in cold blood and immediately set up the Libyan Central Bank. Iran has been actively campaigning to pull oil sales off of the dollar for some time now, and it has recently secured agreements to begin trading its oil in exchange for gold. In response, the US government, with mainstream media assistance, has been attempting to build international support for military strikes on the pretext of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. In the meantime, they established sanctions which US officials openly admit are aimed at causing a collapse of the Iranian economy. Syria is Iran's closest ally, and they are bound by mutual defense agreements. The country is currently in the process of being destabilized with covert assistance from NATO, and though Russia and China have warned the United States not to get involved, the White House has made statements within the past month indicating that they are considering military intervention. It should be clear that military intervention in Syria and Iran isn't being considered. It's a foregone conclusion, just as it was in Iraq and Libya. The US is actively working to create the context which gives them the diplomatic cover to do what they already have planned. The motive for these invasions and covert actions becomes clear when we look at them in their full context and connect the dots. Those who control the United States understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set off a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is absolutely nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. But rather than accepting the fact that the dollar is nearing the end of its lifespan, the powers that be have made a calculated gambit. They have decided to use the brute force of the US military to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. That in itself would be bad enough, but what you need to understand is that this is not going to end with Iran. China and Russia have stated publicly and on no uncertain terms that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. Iran is one of their key allies, one of the last independent oil producers in the region, and they understand that if Iran falls, then they will have no way to escape the dollar without going to war. And yet the United States is pushing forward in spite of the warnings. What we are witnessing here is a trajectory that leads straight to the unthinkable. It's a trajectory that was mapped out years ago in full awareness of the human consequences. But who was it that put us on this course? What kind of psychopath is willing to intentionally set off a global conflict that will lead to millions of deaths just to protect the value of a paper currency? It obviously isn't the president. The decision to invade Libya, Syria, and Iran was made long before Obama had risen to the national spotlight. And yet, he's carrying out his duty just like the puppets that preceded him. So who is it that pulls the strings? Often the best answer to questions like this are found by asking another question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Obviously, those who have the power to print the dollar out of thin air have the most to lose if the dollar were to fall. And since 1913, that power has been held by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private entity owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful banks in the world. And the men who control those banks are the ones who pull the strings. To them, this is just a game. Your life and the lives of those you love are just pawns on their chessboard. And like a spoiled 4-year-old who tips the board onto the floor when they start to lose, the powers that be are willing to start World War III to keep control of the global financial system.
The United States has gone through multiple currencies and central banks in its 240-year history. A central bank allows for the expansion and contraction of our currency supply, which affects the prices of goods and services in our economy. Since our latest central bank was created in 1913, $1 US can only purchase 4 cents worth of what it could in 1913.
Street demonstrators turned the area of the World Trade Organization conference into a war zone. Over 500 National Guardsmen and state police are called in to help restore order in what became known as the Battle of Seattle. The major media focused on the chaos and the mob's demands.
Let them go!
Yet they carefully avoided raising the issue as to how the groups on the street were organized and funded, or whether their leaders might have a hidden agenda. Instead, the media portrays such demonstrations as natural outpourings of genuine grassroots concern.
We're just normal people who are tired of the exploitation of multinational corporations.
Again, for those who orchestrate these events, it's the illusion that counts.
The familiar media melodrama of the anti-globalization movement that we have seen at Seattle and some of the other protest venues is really a classic example of bracketing an issue with false alternatives, because we're told that these are people who oppose the global agenda. After all, they're called anti-globalization activists. Well, what is it that they oppose? They don't oppose global government. They believe that there is too much free market capitalism in the world, and that government at a global level has to be more assertive in imposing controls over the free exchange of goods and services.
But you see that both of these sides are really calling for empowering the United Nations.